Morgan, what is that?
The YouTube page.
Oh, the YouTube page. Oh, all right. So when you go live, you find the latest one.
That is the latest one.
No man, I'm going live now, so that can be. I'm going live now, so that can be.
Just go all the way over.
Go. Follow me.
Mr. Fraser.
Go. Follow. Go. Follow.
Ready? That's a good topic. You do about probably Friday by myself.
Right. She would have to. It's not right here.
Against that right here.
Yeah.
Okay. Sounds like first. I said that. Oh, no, it's good. So you want to send here? This one. Is the screen showing them? You have to back the screen. See, come over here. Okay. Who's trying to see?
When she stands, I'm going to request that you unmute. You will see come over.
And then I will stop you from sharing so that the camera will pick her up. And then when you begin your presentation, then you start sharing again. No, not yet, because this is up and this is fine for now. Once she begins to speak, I will indicate.
Yeah.
So when you have a laptop, don't have enough lane.
No.
Sharing the one.
Mm-mm.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, students, viewers online. It's my privilege this morning to welcome you to the launch of the online component of the Council of Education's Norman Manley Law School Legal Aid Fair for 2025. Under the theme, Law of the Sea, Land and Me, charting a sustainable future for all. I am Tristan Robinson and I will be your host for this morning's session. As we begin this week's activities, let us invite Miss Alicia Fraser, President of the Norman Manley Law School Students Christian Fellowship, to offer a word of prayer.
Good morning, everyone. I'll invite you all to bow your heads as you begin the prayer. Most righteous and heavenly Father, we thank you for today, mighty God. We thank you for the gift of life and for waking us up in a sound mind. We pray, dear Jesus, that for today you will guide us with every step that we take this week. I pray that, as a matter of fact, you'll guide us through this entire week of activities. I pray that you be with every speaker, with every technical support, mighty God. I pray that during this week you'll be at the center, and this week of activities will be informative to the Lord. Have your way throughout this week, like only you can, mighty God. In your precious name, I pray. Amen.
Thank you so much, Ms. Fraser. At this moment, I will be inviting Mrs. Lassine Wisdom Barnett, the director of the Norman Manley Law School Legal Aid Clinic, to give an overview of the work of the clinic and this week's activities.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our legal aid fair. Now, we're very excited to be able to deliver the fair for 2025. This session marks the opening of our online activities, and the fair runs from Monday, today, January 27th, up on till Thursday, January 30th, online. Now, the Norman Manley Law School has one of its mandates as being making sure that we play our part in upholding the rule of law. And what it means for the clinic is that we engage in public education exercises such as this. And of course, we're going to be going out on Wednesday to the Mono Baptist Church to ensure that we have with our stakeholders the opportunity to participate in further public engagement and education. Now, this year's theme, the law of the land, sea, and me, charting a sustainable future for all, is important. When we look around, we recognize that climate change is one of the things that is a live discussion. What does climate change mean for us? It means that when you and I are looking around, we are seeing rising sea levels. We're also noticing that the temperature is on the rise. We notice that farming is challenged because of all that is happening. We have increased hurricanes. We have a lot of things that are happening that are affecting food security. It's also impacting on the health and well-being of our citizens. For us as Caribbean nationals and persons who reside in this region, it is frightening. Many of you are aware of, our neighbors, what they're experiencing. And some persons are beginning to lose homes and possessions because of climate change. Climate change is also impacting on what you're eating at the table. Because when you sit down for your Sunday dinner and you miss your tomatoes or you miss your vegetables or other things, you notice what's happening. So it's also impacting on food and availability of food. It's impacting also on our power, because most of what we use for power, we either get it from hydro, wind, and of course we get it from the seas. But if there's a storm at sea, the ship won't make it here. And so climate change really has far-reaching implications for us here. So this year, we are going to explore what is happening. And it's not just about climate change, it's about sustainability in general, because we are an aging population. The baby boomers are now faced with retirement. And so what does it mean for persons as they get older? Is their will ready? Is it prepared? Or do they have health services? Are the housing accommodations that we have for the elderly suitable? Or are they going to be struggling to make it up the stairs because the houses are not designed properly? So some of those discussions will take place this week. And as we go into our outdoor activity on the 29th of January at the Mona Baptist Church, we expect to see you in the viewership audience, as well as the law students come out and participate.
Thank you, Mrs. Barnett, for that eye-opening speech on climate change. And I am sure all of us will know how very impactful climate change is. And so in fact, this morning we'll be speaking about climate change and resilience, the way forward for Caribbean states. So at this moment, I invite Ms. Francine Green to introduce our first presenter.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. So Dr. Sarah Edwards, she is a lecturer and lab curator in the Department of Geography and Geology at the University of West Indies Mona campus. She has a PhD in landscape history from the University of UWI Mona, a Master's of Science in Environmental Management, also from the University of London, and a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Sciences from the University of the West Indies Mona as well. Dr. Edwards has published several articles, including Governance and Conservation Effectiveness in Protected Areas and Indigenous and Locally Managed Areas, as well as Recipes for Resilience, Engaging Caribbean Youth in Climate Action and Food Heritage through stories and songs, as well as other articles. She is also a member of the Caribbean Coastal Area Management Foundation Board, the Geography Awareness Week Planning Committee, and a contributor to the World Justice Project. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our speaker, Dr. Sarah Edwards.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning to the persons who are with me in the room and to those joining online via YouTube. And there might be other persons. No, Zoom is just being used as a feed for the YouTube channel. So welcome to those who are joining virtually. The title of my presentation, Climate and Resilience, the Way Forward for Caribbean States, will take us through sort of a background to climate change and climate studies, but without being too technical, but for us to appreciate what we're talking about, and then look at it a little bit more intimately in terms of some selected sectors that are relevant to the Caribbean. And then finally, not have us disassociated from the process as onlookers, but very much as active participants in the way forward in terms of being solutions oriented. So a broad overview of my presentation is that we will look at sustainable development goals, because climate change, as the director alluded to, is very much enshrined and connected to the sustainable development of the region. For this morning, we're going to drill into Sustainable Development Goal 13. Then we will look, which relates specifically to climate change. Then we'll have a look at climate change. And then we will examine some of the hazards. And then in particular, we'll try to define what is risk, what is vulnerability, and what is exposure. Because I know in law, understanding the subtleties and how various things are defined becomes very critical. And then, of course, because we're all persons and caught up with this ongoing phenomenon, what can we do? We're not powerless. So the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which are basically a call to action to end poverty and inequality, to protect the planet and ensure that all people enjoy health, justice, and prosperity. So there are Sustainable Development Goals that speak to education, to hunger. They speak to reduced inequalities, in particular, even gender inequality. And then the one that we are going to be focusing on, climate action, which is Goal 13. Goal 13 examines climate action. And in particular, it has three main aspects. Firstly, to limit warming of our global planetary temperature to just 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And we say pre-industrial levels, and that basically brings us to around the time period of 1850, when we had the big surge in industrial development and modernization and factories and large development, industrial outputs. And this 1.5 Celsius has a tagline you may have heard, 1.5 to stay alive. And this has been set out in the Paris Agreement, where it seeks to limit global greenhouse gas emissions before 2025. So when this agreement was made, the year we are in was the target year. And we won't get into recent withdrawals from key players from this agreement. It also says that these emissions must decline by 43% by 2030. That's just 5 years. Now, for some of you who have done degrees or various programs, you know that 5 years is no time really, because you step in and suddenly you're at the end. And we should arrive in another 20 years after 2030 to net zero. So as a result, countries around the world are articulating climate action plans to cut emissions and adapt to climate impacts through nationally determined contributions. You will see these referred to when you're doing your Google search as NDCs. So NDCs are pretty much like going to the doctor. each country takes a look at itself and says, what's my situation? So the prescription is actually tailored to the country. It is not an imposed target or a suite of declarations, but rather each country says what is needed and what is doable in their own context. What I can say is that current national commitments are not sufficient to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. And we see that as we go through time. We had 2024 in our immediate memories, a year where we had, in the case of Jamaica and other places, we had Beryl as a very early season hurricane, and we saw how quickly Beryl strengthened. So we recognize that some of the hazards that we have lived with are changing in the way they present themselves. Climate change. What is climate change? So climate change is really our code red warning. That's why we have these sharp targets, the 1.5, and we have 2025, 2030, 2050. And the scientists have been sounding warnings for some time. And I would like to probably say that the window is not closing, but has pretty much closed to avoid climate catastrophe. The California wildfires, hurricanes, floods, droughts, all of these things are pointing to a window of opportunity that we most likely really don't have anymore. In examining climate change, I'd like to point you to radiative forcing, which is the amount of excess energy trapped within the Earth's climate system due to the variation of a climate change factor, such as greenhouse gas concentrations. And we know what happens when we have this excess energy. And this is where we have the temperatures and all the spin-off effects from the greenhouse gases. Now, something that's very important to clear up is climate change versus climate variability. We often speak about climate change, but some of the things that we attribute to climate change are actually climate variability. So when we have variability, it is effects that are beyond maybe an individual event or a few close events. They may even be happening over a year or 2 or 5. When we are talking about climate change, we are referring to variations that persist for a longer period of time, typically decades or more. Because it's like, think of you going on a diet. You step on the scale one day, you've lost a pound. Is that real weight loss or just a little variability because of what you've done? You know, you may have exercised or eaten a little more conservatively. It's going to take several months, maybe a year or 2 of sustained loss that you have maintained to say, yes, my weight has changed. So, in similar form, climate change is only established after we have long-term trends. So, for climate change, we have an increase in tropical cyclones, known as hurricanes in this region. We can have extratropical cyclones, so they're occurring outside of the tropical region. Just this week, there was a storm in the UK affecting Scotland and Ireland and other places. And it was described by someone as a Caribbean hurricane that lost its way, because the same things that we experience in terms of the high winds, trees being toppled and so on. So it's occurring outside of the tropical zone. We have also events that happen outside of the season. So we have this season defined as June 1st to November 30th. But if you're having an event in May or December, then it's not within the time frame that we would associate with a typical season. We can have severe thunderstorms. We can have what we would hear in our Caribbean weather reports as hydrometeorological events. So it's dumping large volumes of rain over the islands of the region or the countries of the region. Wildfires, aka bushfires. We can have flooding because these rainfall events that bring large amounts of rainfall in very short periods can trigger flooding. I'm sure we're no longer strangers to hearing the words low-lying areas are now under flood watch, flood warning, or persons in low-lying flood-prone areas are being asked to be prepared to evacuate. Those are common taglines, add-ons to our weather alerts now. And of course, we have coastal flooding, and that coastal flooding now happens because of waves, high waves that are, or also known as storm surge, which are coming ashore. So we also have to get accustomed to terminology in the science, and which you should be able to appreciate. If you're maybe going to have to represent somebody, is the notion of return periods. If you have a building that you're designing or a bridge that is being designed by an engineer or their architects, you are now expected to design for the most severe return periods. Or, as I will indicate in a subsequent slide, what we call pathways. So we have different climate change scenario pathways, and based on these pathways, you are expected to go for the most extreme events. So what are some of these effects that we're going to perhaps experience from the decades of change that we are now going to attribute to as climate change? So we have things such as rising sea surface and sea temperatures. So the water column near to the surface and in relatively shallow areas of seas becomes much warmer, which can lead to die-off of coral reefs. So it's not just the temperature on land that is important, that makes us turn on the fans and the ACs. It's also the temperature of our seas. The director alluded to sea level rise, which is particularly critical for places like Jamaica and the Caribbean as small island developing states, where because of the small size, some islands such as Dominica, St. Lucia, Grenada, St. Vincent, Jamaica, we all have mountainous interiors. So a lot of our settlement happens to be along the coast. We have a lot of coastal infrastructure, roads, airports. And so sea level rise is going to be quite significant for these places. We will also experience drought. So it's not only about rainfall and water, but sometimes the opposite of the lack of precipitation occurs. And so we experience droughts. As you know, when we have a drought, crops fail or the yield is restricted, and therefore that affects food prices. That was mentioned in our introduction. And it's not just for food supply and food security, but it's also impacting the livelihoods of the farmers that make up our agricultural sector. And of course, this slide says disasters. I prefer to use the term hazards. We will have medium to large scale hazards increasing between 2015 to 2030. And we have seen that happening in terms of how quickly storms change. I remember one particular storm, it was like every 2 or 3 hours, it changed in category. Going into church on the Sunday morning, it was a category 3. At the end of service, 2 hours later, it was a category 4. So persons often used to say, oh, hurricanes, you can track them, you can see them coming. But in reality, if they are increasing in intensity and going from a category 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, sometimes you are unable to prepare for the intensity that you are going to experience. So you might say, well, the forecast says it's going to come as a tropical storm or a category 1. I don't think I'm going to put up my shutters because I'll be okay. But then by the time you hear the next alert or advisory, you have a category 3 or 4 storm, and you are unable to respond with putting in those shutters that you thought were not necessary. So we need to appreciate that our rising global temperatures, if they continue without any change and the trend continues, we are going to have more extreme weather. Part of our planning, part of what the scientists do, is they have what are called RCPs. And these are pathways where different scenarios are put forward. Now, the pathways, as the slide on the right shows, is, well, not the slide, but the figure on the right, you see going from bottom upwards, you have RCP 2.6, 4.5, 6.0, 8.5. 2.6 is your most conservative pathway. It is the one that we would be doing all the things that we should be doing. We would have contained or rise in temperature to the 1.5 target. RCP 8.5 is if we do not do what we're supposed to do. If we continue unabated in the way we do things, basically the business as usual option. So if we continue, you can see what is going to happen with emissions. So these representative concentration pathways are ways of showing what happens if we do things in different ways. So to the left, let's explore them a little bit very quickly. So in 2.6, we're using renewable energy, we're capturing our emissions, and we're using sustainable forms of transport, and sea level rise is contained to 0.4 meters. And extreme weather events will have a very small increase. And adaptation required will be at a low cost. If we go, as you go through from 2.6 to 8.5, you will see that there is less renewable energy, or there might be a mix of renewable with coal-fired power, and we are using cars, trucks, large vehicles. We're not using hybrid vehicles. So we are being very unsustainable in our actions. And of course, with that will come higher sea levels, more extreme weather, and of course, higher levels of adaptation. If you travel within the Caribbean, you'll see countries like Suriname spending lots of money to build seawalls. Guyana has a seawall because of sea level rise. You will see persons converting to slab roofs because in Dominica in 2023, I met a lady who had lost her roof 3 times. And it took the third loss for her to switch from the regular roof with zinc and rafters to putting in a slab roof. So as you know, it's more expensive to put in a slab roof, but she had said, I'm tired of having my roof blown away. So the cost of adaptation, bridges that you're going to build have to be for higher levels of water when the rivers become absolutely engorged with water. So the adaptation costs come in many ways. We have moved away from RCPs to what we call shared socioeconomic pathways, where we have refined those RCPs now to look at things such as the population of the country, education levels, and the government policies that are actually in place. And so the shared socioeconomic pathways are defining how the choices we make societally can lead to changes in radiative forcing. And we had defined radiative forcing previously. So pathway 1, which is at the bottom left, is tagged taking the green road. And if we go around anti-clockwise, well, if we go to the next one, sustainable, we go to shared socioeconomic pathway 3, we can see that we have a rocky road. And if we go to 4, we have a divided road where things such as the elite, we're not thinking about all the persons in our society, there is high consumption, high inequality, and so on. And of course, we have pathway 5, which is taking the highway, which means we are going to get to a very disastrous state by taking the highway or the fast way. And you can see this in this slide. I don't know why on my computer the slide has moved on, but I don't know, it's not on the screen. Go back. For some reason. Right, here we go. So we go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. And as you can see, the temperatures, the change in global mean temperature starts off low and gets extremely high by the time you get to SSP 5. And that's not where we want to go. So we really have to aim for somewhere, ideally at the 2.6, but perhaps more realistically at pathway 2 at 4.5. Now, so we've looked at the climate and the climate science and the modeling and the pathways. What does that mean for us? Again, I'm having a little stick between the slideshow and the screen. Right, so we have various hazards. We have hurricanes, we have floods, we have intense rainfall. Having a little challenge in lab between the systems. I'm sorry, I'm apologizing because I don't know what's happening with the technology here. All right. I'm currently talking about hazards. And so we have hazards, hurricanes, floods from intense rainfall, landslides, there's sea level rise, there's storm surge, we have temperature and heat, and drought. Temperature and heat, I want to flag because that leads to human health implications, heat stress. I can think of events at my daughter's school which have had to be shortened or different accommodations made because of the ambient temperatures for where the event would be as an outdoor event. We have to think of children playing. We have to think of playgrounds and the heat they're experiencing. For drought, we have to think again about crops. So it's never any one thing. It is what you are presented with as hazards. What we have been doing in Jamaica is that we have been looking at what we call priority sectors. So we started out with doing the State of the Jamaican Climate Volume 3, which is the latest review of climate in Jamaica, and not just climate in terms of what's happening with rainfall, what's happening with temperatures, what's happening with storm frequency, but we also began to look at what were deemed priority sectors. Health. If you're having rainfall, you might have accumulated water where mosquitoes can breed. You will have vector-borne diseases. We look at issues of water, such as water available for agriculture, water available for domestic use. Where I live, which is near to UWI, we went through a severe drought in 2023. Persons were buying or sharing the cost of truckloads of water for their homes because the water supply for the area, the catchment, had basically dried up. We have to consider effects for tourism because tourism will get impacted by storms, sea level rise, storm surge, coastal erosion. We have to consider agriculture in terms of what is being produced, and we have to look at coastal areas. Within the coastal areas, I'm referring to not only just infrastructure such as roads, piers, airports, but also mangroves, seagrasses, coral reefs. We have persons who come to look at reefs for diving. There is dive tourism. And in a little while, you'll see the connection to seagrass beds and mangrove areas. So what we have done is we have the State of the Jamaican Climate, Volume 3. There is a full report as shown to the left, and you have the summary for policymakers, which is a shortened form of the report. We have developed vulnerability and action plans for the sectors that I have described, and the Climate Studies Group of MONA have also prepared a State of the Caribbean Climate report as well. So summing up the challenge of climate, we have seasonality and the size and the sector, which tells us a little bit about sensitivity. I'm speaking to my screen. I'm hoping that it will catch up. We also have sensitivity plus variability, which tells us a little bit about vulnerability, what is happening with various areas and their particular weaknesses. And then we have vulnerability and the actions that we do in response that speak to resilience. And what we want to get to is to being resilient. So we have moved away from adaptation, or there is still adaptation occurring, but we must be mindful that we have to also, because of how frequent and intense these things are, become resilient. So we have hazard, we have vulnerability, and the vulnerability can come in various forms. They can be physical ones, they can be social, they can be economic, they can be environmental. The exposure can come in the various sectors I've outlined, and they can affect the population, they can affect assets such as buildings, businesses, or sectors. So that's what I was speaking to there. Again, apologies for the lag between the system. So what we have been doing is we have been framing and looking at assessments. We have been assessing vulnerability, developing risk profiles, preparing and validating vulnerability risk assessment reports, identifying and assessing our options for adaptation, and preparing and validating climate change adaptation strategies and plans, and submitting these to various government departments. So we've done these, we've had some consultations with the various sectors, namely persons in health, agriculture, tourism, water, and arrived at some adaptation plans. Just what does this mean visually? So we have a hazard, and we're looking at the alligator pond area on my screen. Hopefully it will catch up very soon on this screen, where you have storm surge, which is high waves that are coming inland. And the storm surge, if we take the blue line, which is the line closest to the sea, which is 50 years. Then we have a yellow line, which is 100 years. And then a red line, which is your most severe event, which is your inundation level at the 150-year or the most infrequent but severe levels. We can see from the satellite imagery that there are a number of homes, roads in Alligator Pond, and that Alligator Pond has a low-lying part and a steeply sloping section. So on the right, you can see that the steeply sloping section does not have a lot of buildings as to the right of the main road coming down towards the sea, but there's a lot of dense settlement towards the left of the road, which is much more low-lying and flat. That means that the area that is in red can have a vulnerability that may not be can have a high vulnerability, and the areas in green, low vulnerability. Why? Because even though the storm surge appears to be greater, it's that there are fewer assets. So we have to look at where it's going to be impacted, not just the actual impact of the hazard. The other thing I wanted to touch on, which is something happening very removed away from our site, is bleaching in coral reefs. Our coastal protection relies heavily on coral reefs for being able to break the force of these high energy waves coming ashore. And dead reefs don't serve us very much use. We also have a lot of reef fishing that goes on with our small fishermen around the island and fisher folk. And again, dead reefs are not very conducive to the fish population. These graphs start at the top left in 2020 and 2021, and then go to the bottom left to 22 to 23, and then from 23 to 24. The extreme red periods are periods where we have reached the most severe alert level for coral bleaching. And coral bleaching does not take many degrees rise in temperature. It just takes 1 degree above your average sea surface temperature to trigger bleaching. So if you look at the scale, you'll notice that the sea surface temperature goes from 20 to about 32. And that as you go from just about 18 degrees to 21, so within 2 or 3, you are already within a bleaching warning. Within 1 or 2 degrees, you're at bleaching watch. And then why the alert levels? Alert level 1 and 2 means that you are going to be having bleaching occurring And if it is sustained as it was in 2023, you will have coral death. And the corals go from nice and pretty colored to being bleached and eventually fully dying. That has implications for our coastal areas. I use this slide to point out that the previous slide, which is about to drift off, is a global model. And in that global model, Jamaica is treated as one temperature because we are so small, we fall within one modeling cell. The reality is that as you go around the island, as the slide shows, and the different colored dots, is that there is variability in sea surface temperature. And one place in Jamaica may not be as critical, and there are other places such as Kingston Harbor or Westmoreland, which are having critical temperatures. And so we need to be mindful of our individual and local context in the Caribbean, because far too often the Caribbean gets modeled at a very high level, and we need to do what is called downscaling to understand what is happening at the island level. And this is where the work of regional scientists becomes important, because then we are able to speak to our reality. I mentioned livelihoods, and on the left, as it will eventually appear, you will see the locations of fishing beaches around the island just as points. What then happens is that we have the storm surge modeled for these areas. And you can see where the deeper blue at the south coast shows where you have higher impacts of storm surge, like in St. Elizabeth, or parts of Westmoreland, and some areas of St. Catherine. So St. Catherine, Clarendon, St. Elizabeth, Westmoreland, potential for high storm surge. The purple fringing shows population. You will notice that around St. Andrew and St. Catherine, St. James, the Montego Bay area, and parts of Westmoreland, we have high coastal population. So that's a number of persons who are going to be affected because of the deeper purple, which says higher population density. On the right, the yellow circles show the total landing of fish based on the estimations from our National Fisheries Authority. This tells us where our most important fishing beaches are, because some fishing beaches, like in Clarendon, Portland Bight area, Rocky Point, might be landing high levels, but their risk of hurricane wave heights or storm surge are relatively low. Whereas others in Westmoreland and St. Elizabeth are comparatively at higher risk because of those waves, which can come in, it can smash boats, destroy pots, their fishing buildings, their little storage sheds on the beach and so on will get impacted. So we not only, again, if we think back to the slide where I was talking about our assets, it's not just the hazard and the extent of the hazard, but what's happening there in terms of livelihoods and economic activity. So reefs, mangroves, and seagrass matter because together they help to protect our coastal environments. The coral reefs are breaking the force of the waves. The mangrove roots are also breaking the force of waves. Seagrass are helping to bind sand, protecting us from beach erosion. And the canopy and the leaves of the branches of the mangroves are helping also to cut the force of the wind. So all of those areas out in the coastal environment become very important. And there's a lot of research happening now in what we call the blue economy, looking at these particular areas and their contribution to our coastal protection. So I'd like to end by briefly going through what can we do. So as you notice, I'm in climate change. It's a little part of the phrase climate change, and we're in it, and there are personal things we can do. At a national level, we can advocate for better building codes and for energy efficiency in public buildings to reduce our consumption of fuel. We can advocate for clean energy and for clear policies and targets. We can make it our right to be informed about government initiatives such as mainstreaming climate adaptation planning, what are our NDCs, and what are our accomplishments, because we have to also not just look at what is wrong or has not gone well, but what actually have been victories. If you see air pollution, report it. In our offices, if you are somewhere where you can be a part of making a change, look at things such as energy efficiency, the use of solar power, LED or other low energy bulbs, use motion sensors for lights in areas where people drift in and out and may not remember to always turn off the switch. Inverter AC units, make sure the windows and doors are properly sealed so cool air does not escape. Make sure our water efficiency is maximized by using low flow fixtures, water harvesting. We can do greening by planting trees because trees help to cool our surroundings. They also trap carbon, they are carbon sinks. We can look at our recycled containers, take your own containers, reusable utensils, plates and glassware, straws, aluminum straws that you can clean and reuse. In general, think, how can I be sustainable? In our communities, develop green spaces, plant trees, because we will be lowering air pollution, absorbing carbon dioxide, regulating temperatures. We can promote urban flooding when we have grassed areas rather than paved areas, so the water has somewhere to go through rather than running across the surface. We can look at providing habitat for birds, insects, and other animals. Building garbage skips to help prevent plastics from escaping to the environment, especially containers for plastic bottles. Establish recycling bins, not just for plastics, but consider your e-waste. I'll hold up my cell phone. You know, what do you do with your old cell phones, your old electronics? Those things are very important. E-waste. In our homes, again, practice energy efficiency with power strips. Wash with cold water, line dry where possible, Energy Star appliances, maximize natural use, natural light use. The top picture in the slide comes up, will show some skylights in my living room because it's a very dark room. We can look at things such as container gardening, which is the picture in the middle. Doesn't matter if you live in an apartment or a townhouse, you can also practice container gardening. We can look at food consumption. Where do you buy your food? Buy local foods where possible. Eat what you buy. Food waste is one of the worst things that happens in our planet. We can eat less genetically modified foods or processed foods. In our yards, we can landscape with low water requirement plants and, of course, plant vegetable gardens and other areas, container gardens. And so finally, choose your vehicles wisely. Drive a fuel-efficient vehicle, hybrids, electric vehicles, maintain your car, because small changes can improve your fuel efficiency. Downsize your vehicles, use a refillable water bottle, stop buying the cases of water and taking a bottle from the case every morning. And clothing, recycle, pass on to friends, buy thrift, pre-owned, gently worn clothing. And I'm going to make a plug for Back on the Rack, which is a charity run by Missionaries of the Poor that accept clothing donations, which they resell, and it helps to cut down. Do a little research on how wasteful the global fashion industry is and how much of the clothing gets dumped in countries that are very disadvantaged when the fashion industry doesn't know where to put the surplus of clothing that has been produced. And it is at this point that I say thank you and invite for any questions or comments from the persons who are in the room or online? Thank you. I don't, is there any access to checking if there are any questions?
I'm checking.
You're checking? All right. All right, not seeing any there. Is there anyone in the room? Sure.
What you said about coral bleaching, what causes it?
All right, so the question from the audience was to expand on coral bleaching. So just gonna go back I don't actually have the mechanism, but corals are actually a composite of two organisms living together in what we call symbiosis, meaning they need to live together for corals to be healthy. And when you have increased temperatures in the sea, one of the organisms is expelled from within the skeleton or the framework of the reef, and it goes out into the water. And if it does not cool off quickly enough, then it does not migrate back inwards. And without the two organisms, the entire the symbiotic organism, which is the reef, will die. What is so tragic about bleaching is that it happens so easily because of the very slight shift in temperature that you need to have this stress or bleaching watch. So if we look on the top graph, we see that for 2020, from January to May, the temperatures were between 28 to around 30 degrees Celsius. In June, July, August, the temperatures started to drift to 30 degrees. So there was a bleaching watch declared. And by September, when we have the light orange, we were on a bleaching warning, meaning that this temperature is enough to make bleaching happen. And then by October, we were on alert level 1. And then we went down, it cooled a little bit, so we went down. We had alert level 1 and then alert, and we went back down to bleaching warning, bleaching watch. If you look to the top right, you can see that in the similar time period of August, September, October, November, we were at alert level 2 just by going from the 30, which is sort of like your 29 degrees, 30 degrees. We were just over in the 30 to 33 range, and those 3 degrees, it only takes 1 to go into watch, but we were now fully in the higher alert level, which means that we had significant coral death across the Caribbean region and globally. And that was one of the worst, if not historically, the worst bleaching event experienced. And then if you trickle down to fisheries, to tourism, to coastal protection, you have several impacts from the bleaching. Sure, question?
My question was, what you spoke earlier a lot about alligator pond and like other vulnerable areas, like low lying areas around the coast. So I guess my question was, what would you recommend to some of the mixing around areas that they could do? To I guess protect their homes. You said you mentioned on the airline what changing to slave. But I was wondering if there's anything else that you recommend for someone who lives in that area to protect themselves or to act more sustainably in their own interests.
All right, so the question for those listening online relates to a low-lying community or a coastal community like Alligator Pond, and what could someone living in that community do in the face of climate change to adapt, become more resilient? First of all, as attractive as it is, where a lot of persons like to be able to step from their front step into the water, we have to observe the setbacks. And there are in the development orders for parishes, there are guidelines set by the National Resources Conservation Authority and by the National Environment and Planning Agency for coastal development, is not to build right out near to the high water mark. It's also to look at the kind of windows, the doors, to look at the roof. It is also to consider making sure that there are things such as hurricane straps. A lot of people still put up a roof without strapping the beams and rafters to the walls, so the roof will lift off in its entirety. It is also about looking at flooding, so consider raised construction, so you're not putting the foundation immediately at ground level, but doing some elevated construction, because where you build now might look okay, but in the 20 years that you live in the location, things change. There is the community of Orange Bay in Portland, and I keep taking pictures as I pass because I have family in Portland, and as I drive to visit family, I always take pictures to watch the movement of the sea inland and the structures that were once having 10, 15 or more meters of coastal land, beachfront between them and the sea is now literally at the back wall. And in some cases, the structures are crumbling because of that erosion. So it is being mindful of not building where you think it's okay, but being mindful of sea level rise, the frequency and intensity of these hazards, and observing setbacks and other construction design considerations. Any other questions? Thought I saw two hands and then, yes.
Going back to the issue of bleaching, is it that temperature rise is the only or the primary cause of bleaching? Because I think I've heard in some forum about even the very tourism that we hope to attract. With persons visiting the coral reefs and so on, that chemicals in things such as sunscreen, lotions and so on, does contribute to bleaching. But I noticed in your presentation, it's about the temperature rises, so I'm just querying that is maybe the predominant cause of it, or there are other things that will result in bleaching.
All right, so coral reefs, the question for those online was, is sea surface temperature the only contributing factor to bleaching? And hence negative impacts on coral reefs. So let me split it up. In terms of bleaching, the bleaching is triggered by temperature and the migration of one of the organisms, and I'm not getting too biological and technical here. So that is directly attributable to temperature. However, coral reefs are susceptible to other impacts. Eutrophication or pollution, where we have discharges of wastewater, sewage, and other waste, can go out into the marine environment, leading to algal overgrowth, which is going to smother the reefs. That's another effect. The person who asked me the question, I'm sorry I didn't get your name, mentioned sunscreens. It has been shown that some of the ingredients in sunscreens, like avobenzone and so on, are damaging to coral reefs. So For instance, when my daughter went to summer camp for the last 2 summers, they gave us a list of safe sunscreens to send them for when they would be doing the snorkeling activity because they did not want them swimming near to the coral reef to expose the corals to these chemicals. And there's also disease. So corals have diseases, they get affected by pollution, they get affected by particular chemicals. Bleaching is just yet another impact. But why I chose to highlight it is because it is attributable to climate change.
Fascinating here. You were talking about we can't just live on the seaside, but there are hotels, Princess Hotel, that is on a mangrove. So I don't see why would you say we can't live there when if we have the right people or the money to build on it, why not just build on it and give it land?
Well, a very good question for those online is I just cautioned about persons building on the coast, but at the same time, we have coastal hotels. This is a peculiar challenge of being a small island developing state. Our revenue from tourism, the tourism dollar, what it contributes to our gross domestic product, and what it is that we are selling as a product, sun, sand, sea. We have hotels that even build out on the water, and they will block the light that reaches seagrass beds, which is another negative impact. However, in many cases, those hotels that have built in the coastal environments have had clauses in their permits that require them that if there was loss of mangrove in the area where the building footprints or the construction footprint is, to replant a stipulated area of mangrove. Some hotels have financed what we call Special Fisheries Conservation Areas, FSCAs. You will see them as legally declared areas. The unofficial or colloquial term for the Special Fisheries Conservation Areas is fish sanctuaries. A number of our fish sanctuaries in Jamaica are funded by foundations attached to hotels. So there is restitution, there is compensation. But the reality of hotels and the tourism sector is one of the reasons when we did the State of the Jamaica Climate Report and we did the vulnerability assessment and the adaptation plans that the tourism sector was pulled out. They are going to be more vulnerable to storm surge. They are going to be more vulnerable to sea level rise. Their very presence on unprotected coastal areas will mean some of them are more vulnerable to the winds. They are high water demanding sectors because of the bathrooms, the pools, the sanitation required in a hotel. So the whole tourism sector and hotels becomes very caught up in a number of dimensions. And it is for that reason why that sector was pulled out for special treatment. So we're not saying that there are more rights or that it's a wealth or money talks issue, but it is also a reality of the Caribbean experience. So we do have to balance, our reality and also what we know we should do in terms of the right thing. The other thing is that I am sure that some persons who are building in coastal areas may not have the same financial resources that a hotel has or the insurance coverage to build back. So we are saying to offset the potential for devastating losses, you should not. I'm going to use the case of Caribbean Terrace in St. Andrew, just past Harborview. That area no longer will and is no longer receiving insurance coverage. And you have had a number of persons who have had to abandon their homes because of repeated damage from storm surge. It's one of the locations that we take our natural hazards students to in my department to show them the impact. And if you go to Caribbean Terrace, you can, as you drive from the coast inland, you can see the impact of the buildings going from collapsed structures to cracked walls to nearly no damage as you go further inland. So you can see to what extent, or to the extent physically where the waves went inland. And therefore, that is why I would say, don't do this, because those persons, some of them have lost their homes and they don't have insurance coverage. Some people, when I say lost, they just abandoned them. Squatters have taken up the structures. Other persons have signs saying, you know, private property, you know, do not trespass, because even though they're physically unable to live there, they still have an investment in the property sites. So those are some of the things that we have to negotiate in our reality of these various locations.
Do we have any more questions? If we don't
Right.
have.
I just want to thank the persons in the audience for their very engaging, probing, and thought-provoking questions that were very relevant to what I spoke about. I really enjoyed that. You know, I was able to engage, so thank you.
Okay, so at this moment, I will be inviting Mr. Jordan Burton, a secondary student, to give a vote of thanks.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank Dr. Edwards for this very informative presentation. We were able to learn a lot about the impact of our behaviors as a nation, as a people, on the future of our planet. And I'd like to just thank you. You covered a few areas that I think was of great interest to us, and we spoke about limiting global warming by 1.5%. And we spoke about the difference between climate change and climate variation. The social impact, the socioeconomic impacts that our behaviors will have, and not just us, but the future generations, and just ways in which we can contribute to policy development as, you know, future attorneys. So I want to just thank you for the presentation.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Oh,